You're here with we are now the Addictions, Drug, and Alcohol Institute at the University of Washington. So today, just to give you a little bit of the logistics rundown, you're in a Zoom webinar, not a meeting. So you are muted and we can't see you unless you're a panelist or a host. Please enter any questions in the Q&A. We'll answer them at the end of the webinar, and any comments into the comment box. The webinar will be recorded and posted here. Oh, I put her, typo, and stopoverdose.org. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that as we gather today, we are on the ancestral homelands of the indigenous peoples who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our indigenous neighbors. So for our agenda, we're going to do a very brief overview of ADI's work with the criminal legal system and people with OUD. We'll have Bill Schrader, who's a second-year UW law student, talk about his personal experience with criminal legal fees and fines. And very excited to have Dr. Alexis Harris, UW professor of sociology, talk about her research on the impact of criminal legal fees and fines. And we'll have a little time for questions at the end. So part of the reason I was excited to have Dr. Harris present was I had the opportunity to watch her talk at the UW The Course, which is UW professors talking about things that are impacting us this year. And criminal legal fees and fines was not an area I was very familiar with, although a third of our syringe exchange survey participants had been in jail or prison in the last year. And I realized this was a topic I needed to learn more about, and also just was so moved by Dr. Harris's work and experience, and was like, this is a wonderful resource for us to share through UW if she was willing. So I was very excited when she agreed. But I'm going to have Mandy just speak very briefly about our work at ADAI, and then we'll dive into the presenters.
Great, yeah. So my name is Mandy Owens. I'm a research scientist at ADAI. A lot of the work that we have done has been trying to bridge evidence into the community. And in particular, when that looks like with our work with criminal legal agencies has been doing training with probation, jails, Department of Corrections, and juvenile justice. A lot of the topics have focused on medications for opioid use disorder, but we've also been doing more trainings on encouraging folks to use a shared decision-making approach when working with people who are incarcerated or under supervision, to try to explore a range of potential treatment options or goals, as well as trying to address the many intersecting levels of stigma that people with substance use disorders who are involved with the criminal legal system can experience. In the last few years, a lot of this work has fallen under the State Opioid Response Grant, where we've been able to provide more in-depth training and technical assistance to 5 jails across Washington state. But also in the last 9 months, we've opened this up into a monthly call with other jails and community agencies around the state as an opportunity for folks to be able to share some of the challenges that they've experienced, questions that they have, as well as strategies to address some barriers and improve the care within their facilities. And so from this work, we've developed a range of resources, all of which can be found on learnabouttreatment.org and stopoverdose.org. As you can see on learnabouttreatment.org, we've got this section devoted to the legal system for professionals. So this is sectioned off into drug courts as well as jails and prisons. So on there, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, we've developed a few materials. This is a brochure on medications for opioid use disorder in Washington state jails, where we highlight some of the relevant laws, lawsuits, and policy guidance that jails and prisons can use to inform the kinds of programs that they offer, as well as frequently asked questions and common concerns that we have heard come up in the trainings that we've done, such as what about diversion? And then in the lower right-hand corner, we also just recently released our 3-part training series on medications for opioid use disorder in Washington state jails. I provide some background information on opioid use disorder and medications, but what is more exciting than hearing from me is being able to hear from some of our jail partners at Kitsap County Jail and Franklin County Jail about their medications programs and why they started them and the benefits that they've seen, as well as being able to hear from another partner, Victor Mendez, who talks about his 25 years of incarceration history and how he has been on Suboxone for the last 8 years and is now working as a recovery coach in OMAC. So really trying to bring together both research evidence, but also trying to lift up the voices of people with lived and living experience and bringing that into the community. And so part of the reason why I'm so excited to hear from our presenters today.
Thanks so much, Mandy. Just was hoping we had some new people on who might want to know a little bit about what we do at ADAI. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Schrader. So appreciative of Bill's time. We've had some great conversations about his experience and really excited to have someone talk about their own experience with criminal fees and fines to add some context and just have the opportunity to share what he's learned. So Bill, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Just a real fast, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. I bought a new laptop, but of course the microphone doesn't work, which is troubling in our new virtual environment. This is my first time really sharing my story and experience in a more professional setting, so I don't know if I'm happy that I can't see participants or not. My name is Bill Schrader. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I'm also a 2L second-year law student at the University of Washington. I want to thank Allison for giving me the opportunity to share my experience. I also want to thank Dr. Harris. Prior to this event, I had never read any of Dr. Harris's work, but within, I think, a day or two of seeing the flyer, see who it all was presenting, I was doing a research paper on the disproportionate impact of DUI LFOs, and Dr. Harris came through in the clutch for me. I was able to learn quite a bit from her research. When you find that paper that's like the golden ticket to being able to complete your research assignment. So thank you for that, Dr. Harris. Last, thank you to the audience for being here, for learning more about substance use disorder, and really learning about how my community has been affected by the criminal justice system. I truly, although I'm in law school and I get the opportunity to do a lot of great things, people in recovery are still my community. As a specific note, I want to thank members of the law enforcement that are here for engaging and working towards a better path forward. The jail partners, Department of Corrections, whoever's here in the audience, thank you. Opiate disorder runs in my family. Even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, I had really close family members who were struggling with prescription painkillers. And I have to tell you, thank God for medical marijuana. They were able to kick the habit and get on something that works for them. And as a part of my family, we're really grateful for that. I grew up in Everett, Washington on Casino Road, and that's back when Casino Road was a pretty tough place to live. There didn't really seem to be any hope or possibility for a better future. I distinctly remember using drugs to change the way that I felt and to fit in. And naturally, we committed crime and caused some harm to our community. But I remember specifically in 2005, the courts and police handled juvenile justice a little differently than they do today. We would get arrested. I remember specifically as a child, 15 years old as a child, getting beat by the police. And I say that last part because I remember this specific police officer who would really give us issues. And I see he's actually been discredited, has faced some corruption, disciplinary action. So these concerns are real. And growing up, you just think that's a part of the system, but I digress. So my disease progressed and I found opiates, and it really unleashed the second phase of my addiction. I was 16 years old when I was introduced to those. And the best way I can describe my addiction is that normal people put intellect over emotion, but I put emotion over intellect. I used specifically, a little trigger warning, heroin. And for that brief moment in rush, I would give up everything. It didn't matter, the punitive actions. There was no specific deterrence for me. I wanted to use drugs, and I would commit crimes in order to support that habit. Um, and as my disease progressed, it progressed to some serious crime. I was arrested quite a bit over the next 5 years, about a dozen times. And the last time I was in jail, I happened to get released into an Oxford house. At this point in time, I was actually on Department of Correction supervision, and I was able to get some access to some resources, and something changed internally within me. I'd gotten quite used to going to jail, and for a brief period of time, I was living homeless in downtown Seattle. But I think finally getting some access to some resources that were moving me in a positive direction. I think too often we talk about tough love and, we need to punish people into recovery, but that wasn't the case for me. That wasn't the case for me at all. What worked for me was having some resources to progress and have some opportunity. And really, I was able to kind of ride that wave and ride the momentum into getting a job. And I've been clean since June 28th, 2012. That's my clean date. So I'm coming up on 9 years clean, which is, I think, I would say that's the most important date in my life. But I think the day my daughter was born probably has changed me significantly more, but that's up for debate. So, I got clean on June 28th, 2012. And, as I want to talk about kind of the next phase of my life as I entered recovery, I think it's very important that I acknowledge something, and that is that I'm a cis white male with very low mental health issues. I won't say I have none, but for the most part, I'm not a member of vulnerable populations. And I have seen, people who don't look like me not have the same success based off not looking like me. So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to say, don't ever use my story as an opportunity to say that you just got to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, because that's not the case. I'm aware that there's some privilege that exists that allowed me that opportunity, and I think we need to dismantle those systems so that everyone can have that opportunity. So I got clean June 28th, 2012. I was able to get a job, and it wasn't the job I wanted. I think that's an impact of the overall criminal justice system, is that with a conviction, many legal opportunities are closed. And so I was able to get a job managing, first I was a janitor at working for a commercial real estate organization. And then I just, I worked hard. I kind of had a chip on my shoulder. And of course, you got to work twice as hard as the next guy, if you don't have an education in any way, shape, or form. Excuse me. I think I had my GED at that time. But I was able to progress to that company, and I was able to start making pretty decent money. But I had that giant looming amount of LFOs, and I owed about $25,000, which is actually somewhat low in comparison to some other people that I know who were in addiction longer. I got clean when I was 21 years old. The last time I was convicted of anything, I was 20. So a relatively short period of time. So 2 years as an adult, I guess I was racking up about, $12,500 a year. You could imagine how that would tumbleweed. And I had to start paying those things off. And what was quite interesting was, and I kind of acknowledged this when me and Allison were talking about it, kind of came out as I was thinking about it. Most of that was for misdemeanor charges, which is so strange to me. And I haven't been able to figure out why that system exists. Maybe the municipalities, rely on it for funding, which is that's a whole can of worms in itself. But I would say well over half of that was for municipal charges, very, I would say very petty things, such as I was homeless, I shoplifted a beverage, and I remember that was $5,000, $2,500 in legal fees, and then, a probation cost. So $5,000 for a homeless person shoplifting a beverage. And that's just the reality of our legal system. LFOs are legal financial obligation. I just saw the question down there in the chat. So those were just looming over me, and I had to start paying on them. So, you know, although I was making pretty decent money, it was all having to go to that. And I was lucky enough in my life to marry the most incredible woman in the world, who also had $25,000 in legal financial obligations. But, you know, so we had about 50,000 hanging out over our head. And, you know, as we progressed in our marriage and started a family, I remember specifically that we probably weren't in a place to buy a house. And that was due to not only the, you know, legal financial obligations, but just, you know, just not in a place to commit to owning a home for 30 years. But when we went to go rent a bigger home when my wife was pregnant, we couldn't get a rental. We couldn't get a rental based off of our credit, the legal financial obligations. And this was before, my understanding is that today, a lot of credit reporting agencies don't actually add legal financial obligations to your credit. And I was reading something that said, you know, it's not really an indicator as to whether you're going to pay somebody. It's just, you know, this oppressive system. It's not something that's an indicator of your I guess worthiness for borrowing. But anyway, so we couldn't get a good rental, so we had to buy a house, and it was probably before we were ready, you know. So I mean, locking into a financial obligation that was we could afford it, but you know, number one, we needed the money to pay those legal financial obligations, but you know, we needed the money for just a variety of different things, and just weren't in that place. And we got ready. We were headed up on closing on that home, and for whatever reason, you know, I'm sure many folks in the audience have purchased homes before. I wasn't able to purchase the home that we were going to buy because I had, you know, a $5,000 left on my LFOs, and my mom had saved up about $10,000 to give to me and my brother. My mom's lower middle class, working class person. This was like her $10,000, regardless if she passed away. She wanted to give each of us $5,000, and she gave me $5,000 to the $5,000 that was kind of her one wish, was that she'd be able to pass me this money when she passed away. She gave that to me so we could purchase a home. And you know, I'm grateful that she had the money, but you know, looking back, you know, on those $50,000 in LFOs, I did the math. If we would have invested that, we'd have gained like $20,000+ in interest, or we could have, you know, put it down on a house, eliminated mortgage insurance, etc. But you know, it's so difficult when you're getting out of incarceration and you're trying to get your life together, and really what you need is resources, including financial resources and opportunity. And having those LFOs bear down on you where those paths are closed, it's really illogical, you know. I remember, I know it's changed since then, but you know, accruing interest while you're incarcerated, coming out of incarceration in collections. And you know, luckily I was able to pay all those things off, and I'm on a great path. I'm at the 2L University of Washington School of Law, and it looks like it's time for me to close up. And I'm just really grateful that I was able to get them paid off, but it was an immense burden.
Bill, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that experience, and it will provide really great context for Dr. Harris's work. Just thank you so much for sharing that and for the work that you're doing now, and just wonderful. So I just want to quickly introduce Dr. Alexis Harris. She's the Presidential Term Professor and Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. Her research fundamentally centers on issues of inequality, poverty, and race in United States criminal legal systems. Her book, A Pound of Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor, details the ways in which sentenced fines and fees often put an undue burden on disadvantaged populations and place them under even greater supervision of the criminal justice system. So just want to thank Dr. Harris for being here with us today and for sharing her wonderful work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to meet you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. See how fast I can do this. This is always a nerve-wracking. Okay, there we go. I'll put you guys over here somewhere. So Bill, it was really nice to meet you, and I hope that we can connect, and thank you for that shout out on that paper. It was actually written along with two of my amazing graduate students, Tyler Smith and Emmy Obara. Emmy was in the Evans School, and they did the deep dive on that paper. So I'm glad it was of use. I want to begin talking a bit about sort of what I study and our contemporary criminal legal system with introducing you to a man named Stephen Long. Several years ago, he found himself evicted from his apartment, was houseless, was unemployed, and living in his truck. He had been in those circumstances for at least 2 years, but on this one particular day, police were called to the area, not regarding his truck, but they noticed his truck parked. And over 72 hours, they came back because there's a Seattle municipal code where you can't have a car parked in the same spot for 72 hours. So his truck, his house, with all of his tools were towed and impounded for 2 weeks. The city of Seattle charged him $557 for the cost that the towing company charged, and he had to enter a payment plan with the city of Seattle, and he's currently in a payment plan with private collections. Mr. Long's case was heard last week by the Washington State Supreme Court to address, in part, one of the issues was the excessive nature of fines and fees, which Bill referred to as legal financial obligations, LFOs, in Washington. I also call them monetary sanctions. This story of Mr. Long's life really represents the expansive nature of our criminal legal system, all the way from just having your car parked where you're living in your car can be a major financial cost, to felony convictions. And I'll detail that out in a little bit more. We see how the contemporary criminal legal system is really a tool that's used to manage all of the social ills. So it's homelessness, it's addressing poverty, it's how our policymakers have chosen to address mental health issues. So 3 of the largest institutions that address mental health in the United States are Cook County Jail, Rikers Island Jail, and Los Angeles County Jail. So those are the 3 largest mental health institutions in this country. And as Bill also mentioned, it's used to address issues related to substance abuse and substance disorder. So over 500,000 people are suffering a mental illness while incarcerated, and 75% of them have a co-occurring disorder like substance abuse. So this is a chosen way that our society has used to address social problems and health issues in this country. Since about 1974, we've had a massive increase, a 500% increase in the numbers of people in this country who live behind bars. About 1 in 115 adults were in jail or prison in 2015. That's 2.2 million people living behind bars, and 4.6 million people on supervision or parole. So this is the context of, in part, some of the people who carry the debt that Bill just talked about. And I really appreciate how Bill recognizes the privilege that some people have when entangled in our criminal legal system. We are an exceptional system in the world in terms of our criminal justice and the way that we disproportionately incarcerate people along racial and class lines. So while 1 out of every 91 white men aged 30 to 34 is in prison, 1 out of every 42 Latinos are in prison, and 1 out of 17 Black men live behind bars in that age range. The rate of incarceration is just as bad disproportionately for Black women. It's 2 times that of white women, and for Latina women, it's 1.2 times of white women. Sarah Shannon is a scholar and a collaborator of mine, and she did an amazing paper looking at estimates of the percentage of the United States population that has been to prison and has a felony. She estimates that 3% of the adult population has been to prison in the United States, but 15% of the African-American adult male population has been to prison. 8% of the adult population in the United States has a felony conviction, and 33% of African-American adult male population has a felony. So 1 in 3 Black men has a felony in the United States. So if we can just think about, and there are no, we can talk about this in Q&A, there are no national statistics to let us know how many people carry this debt that Bill described. But if we think about the numbers of people who have felony convictions and have been to prison, and the disproportionate rate at which African-American men experience criminal legal entanglement, we can only sort of surmise a high percentage of people that walk around carrying this debt. In addition to the expansion of the criminal legal system, we can connect it with what we saw this summer. Well, we see it all constantly, but with the killing of Mr. George Floyd this summer and the state-sponsored violence in this country, the expansion of the criminal legal system allows for this type of contact. And other colleagues from the University of Washington, Frank Edwards, Hedy Lee, and Mike Esposito, did an estimate of lifetime risk of being killed by a police officer in the United States. For women, it's 1 in 33,000. For men, it's 1 in 2,000. But for Black men, 1 in 1,000 have an estimated lifetime risk of being killed by a police officer in this country. And that's part of the system of monetary sanctions that allow police officers to surveil and send out warrants on these folks. The authors conclude that being killed by a police officer for men, young men in their 20s, is one of the highest risks of death in this country for Black men. I had a thing on collateral consequences. I'm not going to go through all of that, but there's a whole bunch of research that talks about the consequences, both the social and legal consequences of people being entangled in the criminal legal system. From, you know, in particular, Alex represents children, right? And for those of you who don't know who Alex is, this one hits home for me. This is a character on Sesame Street that was introduced several years ago to help children who identify with him. His mother was incarcerated. Right? So incarceration is so expansive in our country that sort of the famous children show that many of us grew up on, right, has a character that represents children so that they have someone that they can sort of recognize, right? And share the experience of having a parent incarcerated. And Alex just sort of hits home and makes me think about how expansive our criminal legal system is. Okay, so we'll dive right into monetary sanctions or legal financial obligations. So this is a bucket of costs that people face when they make contact with our criminal legal system. My work has done, my book is in Washington State, but I've just completed an 8-state study. I had collaborators in 8 states. So Washington is not an outlier. This is sort of the norm. So in Washington, people can be charged for restitution. So if I steal your car, I might be charged for the cost for your insurance company or to fix the car. In addition, I'll have a fine. First time drug offense is $1,000 in Washington State. Second time is $2,000. So the fine is meant to be a punishment, a hurt. And then there's fees. There's costs for using the system, the criminal system user fees. So there's fees for the public defender that has been appointed to you because you can't afford the public defender. You're charged in Pierce County, it's a flat $450 that people regularly get at the end of conviction, right? So at the time they're being sentenced to jail or prison, they're also getting costs for the public defender if you opt for a jury. Right, it's $250 for a 12-person jury, but you get a discount if you go for a 6-person jury. There's paperwork. There's cost of incarceration. In many states, the Department of Corrections actually sue people after they've been incarcerated to try to recover the cost of their daily stay in prison. On top of that, many states, not Washington, but many states have surcharges, so a percentage of the whole principal that you're charged on top of that. In Washington, up until 2018, we charged 12% bill. This is probably why your bill was so high, 12% interest on everything, right? In 2018, the law changed and now it's 12% interest on restitution only. And then there's costs. There's costs to enter payment plans. There's costs per payment. So when I go to make a payment on my LFOs, right, say I owed $100 or $1,000 and I pay $100, there's a certain cost that they charge me to even process my payment. So this is the realm of monetary sanctions. Just so you have a sense of the money in Washington alone, this is data from the Administrative Office of the Courts in Washington between 2000 and 2014. This is only on what's called mandatory. There's a mandatory victim penalty assessment, VPA, that's charged to individuals. For felony, it's a mandatory $500 regardless of the type of crime. And for misdemeanor, it's $250 regardless of the type of crime. So in that 15-year period between 2000 and 2014, about $173 million was collected just on the VPA alone. It's about 50% of the amount that was outstanding, and about 170 million was outstanding in 2014 in these 15 years that was collected. In terms of people, 25% of the people who were sentenced the mandatory VPA paid, but 75% over those 15 years still owe in 2014. 75% of the people still owe. We can talk about this a little bit later, but policymakers are really excited when they see 173 million and they don't want to change it, but they're not looking at who's paying. 25%, so 75% still carry all of the financial consequences related to this outstanding debt. So I'm just going to summarize my book here. The main findings, I'm going to go through 3 different sort of research findings. And overall, my book, I argue that the criminal legal system manages a very distinct population in this country. It's disadvantaged both pre and post conviction and incarceration. As I mentioned, many people who are entangled in the criminal legal system have mental health issues. They have substance use disorder. They might be homeless. They might be unemployed, lack formal education. There's a host of social ills. So it's a very distinct population from the get-go of who is put into the criminal legal system. And then we process them and we perfectly label, stigmatize, and then financially burden folks and impose further legal consequences to poor people. So when people do not pay, they'll have warrants put out for their arrest. They'll have additional financial penalties. In Washington, we suspend their driver's licenses. So we give all of these additional penalties that are directly related to their poverty status. We then perfectly sort the already marginalized and further cement them to lives of inequality. And in addition, we allow perpetual state surveillance. So if you're poor and you can't pay your LFOs, you're going to be on continual court supervision, continual intervention, called to court, summons to court to explain why you're not able to pay, to explain where you're living, to explain your employment circumstances every single month. And it controls. Ultimately, the effect is to control poor people in this country. One specific research study I recently did with a colleague, Frank Edwards, who's a UW sociology PhD and now a professor at Rutgers University. We did this summer for Seattle Municipal Court, and we found that people sentenced to criminal traffic cases tended to have legal financial obligations accounts open for longer periods of time compared to other types of cases. So we might think that's the more severe felonies, but it's these misdemeanor court cases that really trap people in long-term periods of debt. And for each class of case that we examined in the municipal court in Seattle, Black men and women were significantly more likely than their peers to be sentenced to incarceration through a Washington State Superior Court, following both a paid and unpaid Seattle Municipal Court legal financial obligation. Okay, what the heck does that mean? That means that we were interested in trying to look at the downstream consequences for people. And we found that for Black men and women, they had a much higher likelihood of being convicted and sentenced in a superior court to incarceration. So the traffic citations, the muni court citations, in particular for Black people, were a gateway, right, into more serious convictions and punishments in Seattle. We also found that people of color have a higher likelihood than white people to be charged with what's called a driving with a license suspended in the third degree, DWLS3, following a Seattle Municipal Court legal financial obligation sentence. And this was especially pronounced for Black drivers. So that means that what happens, unpaid traffic ticket triggers a loss of or suspension of your driver's license. Driving without your driver's license, you get pulled over by the police and you get a DWLS3, which means more fines and fees and also incarceration. And so this is really an example of what poverty and plus the criminal legal system leads to surveillance and control. And then I'll do one more research piece that we found in my book. Which was mostly interview and observations in courts. But I made the argument that legal financial obligations exacerbate poverty and inequality. And my ideal goal, and I'm not a statistician, but my ideal goal was to map this statistically. How can we see certain pockets of poverty in Washington state, and what happens long term if these communities carry debt? And so the question that I am working with two amazing grad students right now, Kate O'Neill and Ian Kennedy in the sociology department, with their statistical skill set in the data that we have for Washington state, and these are all cases for a period of 15 years, that we observe that legal financial obligations per capita are spatially concentrated. So we do have these debt blocks in Washington state where neighborhood blocks owe a significant amount of legal financial obligations to the criminal legal system. Higher poverty neighborhoods, so not surprisingly, also tended to have higher per capita LFO debt burdens. Poor neighborhoods carry high amounts of a debt burden. And LFOs are associated with increases in future poverty rates. We look downstream. What happens when in, say, 2000, a debt block owes this amount of legal financial obligations? What is their poverty status 10 years down the road? And this association was higher or stronger in non-white neighborhoods. So this is what it looks like here. This is Seattle. Lake Washington is right here. This is Mercer Island, just to orient you. University of Washington is right here. And I mean, we could give a whole talk on residential segregation in Seattle alone. But MLK and Rainier Avenues flow along this way. So the darker the color, the higher both per capita LFO debt burden and higher tract poverty level. So the dark squares really represent both poor neighborhoods in the census tract and neighborhoods that have LFO debt burden. So you can visually see this in our own community, that poor neighborhoods carry high amounts of debt to the state. To sort of summarize how I sort of think about the contemporary system of legal financial obligations, a sociologist named Eduardo Bonilla Silva describes the notion of colorblind racism as an ideology that explains contemporary racial inequality as the outcome of non-racial dynamics. In contrast to the era of American Jim Crow racism and the preceding 250-year practice of enslavement, which both explicitly emphasize racism as determining laws, practices, and life chances, Eduardo Bonilla Silva provides a frame for, quote, whites to rationalize minorities' contemporary status as the product of marker dynamics, naturally occurring phenomena, and Blacks' imputed cultural limitations. I suggest that the system of monetary sanctions is at once a political, economic, and socially controlling tool of the state that is deep-seated within the ideology of colorblind racism. The sentencing option is set within the context of a system, as I mentioned, that disproportionately arrests, prosecutes, sentences, and incarcerates Black people. Situating the system of monetary sanctions within the disproportionate rates that we talked about earlier in my slides, large numbers of people of color shoulder the burden of penal debt. Our data analysis highlights the disproportionate way that Black and Latino people are sentenced to monetary sanctions. But the policy is still really viewed as race neutral, with the intent of holding offenders accountable, punishing, and at the same time recouping criminal legal costs. However, the communities of color disproportionately carry these sentences, and the long-term debt goes unrecognized. This is just sort of a historical figure that sort of helps me contextualize the contemporary system of monetary sanctions. In the 1600s, we had enslavement of people of African descent. About 388,000 Africans were transported to North America. At the end of legalized slavery, the 13th Amendment in 1865 was ratified, and it said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, nor any place subject to their jurisdiction. So at the moment that people were released from bondage in this country, policies were set up that said, wait, if you're convicted, we can re-enslave you. And that's exactly what happened. At the end of enslavement, there were practices called slave leasing, where people were leased out to private entities to generate profits. Same thing, Black codes were developed to duly convict Black people who were standing on a corner past an hour that they weren't supposed to, for looking at white people in a manner in which they weren't supposed to, for not entering a legal contract of employment and having that paper on their body. Those folks were duly convicted and then leased out. There was convict leasing, and in this time period, there weren't a whole lot of prisons. That process became too deadly. Too many people were dying, and prisons were being built on the very plantations in which they and their parents had been enslaved, right? So here you owed your daily labor to the state. And we've moved forward with mass conviction and incarceration, where close to 2 million African-American men are under supervision from the criminal legal system. And on top of that, they owe monetary sanctions. So they don't even owe their current day labor, but their future labor with interest and per payment plans. So that's why I refer to the contemporary system of monetary sanctions as a contemporary iteration of social control in this country. It's different, it's not as physically egregious, but in the end, it's exactly the same. You owe money to the state and also third-party entities, just like slavery allowed third-party entities to generate money off of people enslaved. Policy reform, I'll get to this real quickly. We've had a lot in Washington State. I'm going to skip this one. We've had a lot. We can talk about it in Q&A, but 3 things you can do now. There are 3 really important bills before the Washington State Legislature. There's HB 1412 titled Relieving Legal Financial Obligations. And this addresses the mandatory fines and fees. While they still must be sentenced, this gives judges discretion to allow people to come to court post-sentence and seek relief. And they can adjust the amount in part dependent upon the financial circumstances of the person or in total. Senate Bill 5226 ends debt-based driver's license suspension. So unpaid traffic tickets will no longer trigger the loss of someone's ability to drive. And then HB 1078 and SB 5086 is voting rights restoration. It's kind of linked to it, but not. I just think it's important that everybody has the right to vote. And this allows people, once they are released from jail or prison, to vote. Currently, if you're on supervision, Department of Corrections supervision, you can't vote. And this actually just causes a lot of misinformation on who's eligible and not. You can also support your local organizations with your money, but also with your time, volunteering and listening to people like Bill, listening to folks who are entangled in the criminal legal system and asking what do they need, right? Following their leadership to help make real change. There's lots of organizations that Columbia Legal Services, ACLU, I Did the Time, Civil Survival, and Black Prisoners Caucus are just one. And I would say, finally engage. I always say, being a Black woman married to a Black man, living in a Black community, I don't have the privilege to sit on the sidelines and not engage. Many people do, right? And so it's up to you to decide when and where you're going to engage and how you're going to engage. So I'll end it there, and we have time for question and answers. Oh, this is always the hard part. Just bear with me. This is always the test. Okay, there, I did it.
The transitions with Zoom can be a little rough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for situating just the experience of people with LFOs in Washington and nationwide within this larger historical context. I just remember watching your presentation and being just blown away and really inspired. So we have a good amount of time for questions. You can either enter them in the chat, or I think there may be a thing where you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, but probably entering them into the Q&A is going to be easiest. I did see one question, which was just VPA, which I think Bill answered. That's victim penalty assessment, correct?
Right. That's the one mandatory, well, that and a DNA collection, but VPA is the mandatory in Washington.
Do people have questions for Bill or for Dr. Harris?
I have a question for Dr. Harris. I want to confirm the VPA, that is charged whether you have a victim or not, correct? That's
correct.
What I thought.
Right. Right. So drug convictions, I mean, you could say yourself as a victim, but yep, everyone gets the VPA, regardless of ability to pay.
Wow.
Yes. Hour is still enforced.
The 72-hour parking law is still enforced. Okay. I see. Can you speak to the expectations of currently incarcerated individuals in paying off LFOs?
Yeah, the expectation is there. They still owe 12% interest in 2018, 1783 was a bill that was introduced that that stopped interest. However, a caveat is that if you're incarcerated, you have to wait till you're released to seek relief on that interest accruing. Judges told me that they sentence fines and fees to people, even people getting life, because, so I did interviews with judges across our state, because they never know when they might hit the lottery. And I said, well, you're incarcerated for life. Well, they could get a settlement. So it's based on current ability to pay and future ability to pay.
And I see Tyrone Brown says, not a question, but full appreciation for Dr. Harris. Thank you.
Oh.
So, in the Q&A. And then in the chat, I see another great book that just came out in February that talks about some of these issues as Halfway Home. And someone else says the VPA funds go to Victim Support Services and Prosecutor's Office. And someone else shared a link, I think, to Halfway Home. And there's also a thank you, Bill, for sharing your story. So lots of thank yous. Oh, thank you. This is one I'm very interested in. Thank you, Bill and Dr. Harris. Do you have any thoughts on the ramifications of the Blake decision decriminalizing simple drug possession?
Bill, you're the last. I can take it.
Well, I think you're still on mute. Oh, perfect. Good.
So I think that's a heavy load, and really what I've seen is that there is some prosecutors' offices who are on board, which, you know, it's the law. So generally, you know, that's how it should be. And they're working with public defense offices and stakeholders to, you know, to reverse prior convictions and take care of those LFOs. And I also have heard rumblings that there are some who I'm not sure what the opposition would be. But I've heard some rumblings that there is some opposition from an office or two. But on the west side, you know, between our three big counties, my understanding is that they're on board with what needs to be done.
Right. So the Blake decision, just for some background, was just decided in February by the Washington State Supreme Court. And it's a major groundbreaking decision that found essentially the person that the case revolved around. I think she said she had borrowed jeans from a friend and was arrested in a non-drug related arrest. But when they took her clothes off of her, found some small amount of drugs in the jeans. And she said she had no idea they were her friend's jeans. And so what the court found was that the police and prosecution have to prove that the individual for simple drug possession charges have to prove that the person knowingly had that drug on them or in their suitcase or in their purse or something like that. So what this does is it's not just about this person's case, but it's about all simple drug possession cases, no matter the type, no matter the amount. Simple drug possession cases in Washington State are all vacated. Right? So they need to be cleared off of everyone's case. This is like the first step to literally dismantling the criminal legal system, because no longer can police do these reverse buy busts, or can they do these simple, they found marijuana on somebody, well, not marijuana in Washington, but heroin on someone, right? So it's a major decision. But on top of that, people are applying now to get their legal financial obligations back with that dang 12% interest. So this is a major decision that really reorients our state to simple drug possession, and hopefully how we can maybe move towards treating folks and giving them a space in a harm reduction space to treat what the underlying problems are.
And I see a comment from Malika Lamont. It should also be noted that Washington State had one of the most regressive possession statutes in the country. It needed to go.
Yep. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I'm glad that Mandy brought up the Blake decision. It's definitely been something we've been talking about a lot. Any other questions? Oh, Cecilia Walker says, I want to thank both Mr. Schrader and Dr. Harris for a superb presentation. Bill, I also appreciate your acknowledgement of privileged persons, and Dr. Harris for the breakdown of this barrier in our state. So mostly just appreciations. So, any questions? I love all the appreciation. Just want to make sure you get people's questions answered. We will be posting this recording on stopoverdose.org on our webinars page. I also see a thank you from, let's see, their name is cut off. But a thank you, Dr. Harris and Bill. Dr. Harris will be able to access the PowerPoint.
I don't make that shareable. That's like kind of the one thing I do from my book. And so I don't share my slides.
But we will have the recording available so people can watch it.
I see, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm staying in my lane. I see
You're good.
Hi, Deborah Espinosa here. That paper's under review for the neighborhoods, like literally under review right now. So we hope it'll get published soon.
Oh, I see two good questions. Clearly, there is data that shows a huge % of people with these LFO that aren't able to pay. How can LFOs be argued as a legitimate policy?
Trying to say this in a diplomatic way. I mean, I think unfortunately, our policymakers, the people that represent us in Washington, are so disconnected from the realities of poverty and drug addiction in this country. I recently testified, and one person said, isn't it common sense that we make people who violate the laws pay for the process? And that's what many people think, that this is a business model, revenue generation. Of course, it makes sense if it's Bill Gates getting arrested, right? Of course, it makes sense if people can pay, but it doesn't make sense when you really look at the numbers of people and the consequences. And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't know if excited is the right word, but I get motivated to do these types of talks so people understand that this process exists. And so that the more public becomes aware, the more pressure we can put on the policymakers, because this is done in our names, right? The policymakers represent us. This criminal legal system exists because in our names for our protection. So until we get riled up and really put pressure on the people who get to make these laws, it's not going to change. And they're so dang disconnected. It makes me sick sometimes.
Thank you. I think that was a tough question, and you definitely handled it very well. So, and I see this is more of a comment. I'm in one of the counties that is very opposed to the Blake decision. A webinar on why this is a move in the right direction would be a great educational tool for us. Just more of a comment. And then someone says to learn more about people's stories about impacts of LFOs, go to Living with Conviction. And someone else says, what was the name of your book again, Dr. Harris?
It's called A Pound of Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor. I wanted it to be permanent punishment, but my publisher said too many P words. So it's a Pound of Flesh. If you Google me, you can get it either at Russell Sage website or Amazon. Thank you.
I don't know where that noise came from. Any other questions? I keep seeing lots of appreciation. That's nice. Dr. Harris, what do you think, if anything, will change now that King County has declared racism to be a public health crisis? That's from Zahir.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of down today. I mean, I think that so many agencies, institutions are symbolically saying these types of things about racism and anti-racism and in particular anti-Blackness. I just want to see the structural change. So I'll appreciate it when I see policy changes about, creating more bed space for people who are addicted. I mean, I think probably everyone on this call has had mental health or drug addiction issues or knows someone who has suffered from these types of illnesses. And it's hard to get a bed space for someone. It's hard to get, low cost treatment for someone. I mean, we've done it in our family. So, King County, put your money where your mouth is, right? And really make that structural change. I wanted to say, and I meant to say this earlier, that I wanted to acknowledge the violence in our country. I mean, it's just heavy on all of our hearts. And both last week and I think it was yesterday, and in South Seattle last week. But I hope that, if you feel that heavy weight, like I feel it right now, that you put it into action and you figure out where you can make a difference.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think none of these are new issues, but the last year has really brought them to light in a way that is really different. So really appreciate you bringing this forward and being part of this conversation with the groups that we work with. I see a few more. Most of these are comments. I think I see one question regarding the bills you mentioned. In addition to contacting our individual legislators, are there lobbying group efforts we can join?
Definitely So Debbie has put up livingwithconviction.org. You can find something there. You can go to ACLU's webpage. You can go to Columbia Legal Services. I'm not sure if they still have a legal clinic on LFOs. Bill, maybe we can work to get a clinic at UW Law. I would love to find something funded and help with that. Tara Simmons, everyone should get to know who Tara is. If you don't know who she is, she's a state representative. We think one of the first nationally that has been incarcerated and convicted, that now is a representative. She's taken the lead in all of these bills that I've mentioned. And so we need to support folks who have been entangled in the criminal legal system and listen to their voices, because they're really leading the way and making changes.
I see a comment that I think is very interesting and something I wasn't aware of. Carla Joe says in the UK, they did a study of people in jail. They found a high percentage of those in jail had experienced health issues, including brain injury, that have not been diagnosed and treated. It's more of a comment and just saying, I think we know that many people who experience incarceration or legal system involvement have overlapping challenges, including many health ones.
Right, many people have trauma, and we also have to remember that incarceration creates trauma as well.
And see lots of people shouting out Living with Conviction. Living with Conviction's legal empowerment program works with UW Law students and Dr. Anna Bosch at UW Law. Let's create a clinic. So sounds like you have other people interested.
We've worked together. They're both Dr. Bosch and Deborah Espinosa are amazing folks on this issue and great leaders in this area, in this space.
And it sounds like Mandy and some others are having good conversation about just seeing lots of good engagement. So loving that.
So I see a lot of, oh, go ahead, Mandy.
Oh yeah, I was mostly just wondering, we do so much work around release planning for treatment and mental health and other services. I wonder about including LFO, addressing LFOs and those kinds of things. Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
So on that note, I've actually seen in a couple systems that aren't in the state of Washington where they try to address that before folks get released, whether that's mainly like you want to get them out of collections or delinquency. Well, I mean, that's where those people are at. They don't want to abolish or, give anyone relief, but, they're not going to add interest and they think that's doing a favor. But I see a lot of comments about an LFO clinic at UW Law. And where we're at with that, it has been discussed. It'd be a lot of in-person stuff. So we have talks tabled until hopefully this pandemic settles down and everyone gets vaccinated, but it is on the table.
So I think we're right almost at time. If people have any questions, they can email them to me and I can route them to our speakers. Or I know Dr. Harris, her email address is on the UW website, so you can contact her. And if people do want a certificate of attendance, just send me an email and we can make one up for you. And I just really want to thank our speakers and for such great participation. Just feel really inspired by the work that both of you do and want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bill, it's great to meet you. We should hook up, and however I can be of support, please let me know.
Absolutely.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you so much.